Matt is a professor of international politics at the Sustainable Consumption Institute, and his research focuses on environmental politics, particularly climate politics, including global climate governance. So today he will be sharing with us his research conducted over the last year, which has tracked the media and political discourses in the UK around net zero policies, technologies, initiatives. And the findings are particularly pertinent at the moment, both the reason that, see, this COP is ongoing at the moment, and it's likely framed a lot of the UK's position at COP, but also the imperative to reduce emissions has never been so high and is growing month by month effectively. And we're still in a position where there is no really coherent strategy within the UK of how we're going to meet net zero. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Matt. Thank you.
Hi, thanks Ruth. Thanks all for coming. Yeah, a little bit of context, and then I'll actually, if you want to share the screen, then or put the PowerPoint up, then I can start by subjecting your picture to the delightful face of Nigel Farage. Apologies for that, but it does sort of encapsulate quite a lot of what I think is going on. So this is the outcome of a small project funded internally within SCI and Tyndall, and we had where we hired Stan Wilshire, who is now a PhD student in politics. At that point was just finishing his master's degree, to think about, well, based on the premise of thinking that actually what it looked like at the beginning of this year, that there was a building pressure, probably for the first time, I think, in 25 years of reasonably sustained climate policy in the UK, where there looked to be some attempts to actually undermine the entire package, right? People starting saying, let's not pursue net zero as a goal. Let's see if we can dismantle some of the main elements of the Climate Change Act, and so on. And so we thought, well, we should look at what's going on here with a view to maybe doing a larger project on this and applying for external funding and so on. So it's a sort of pilot project. And so we did what we could do within the constraints of our internal resources. And what we focused on then was on the sort of rhetorical strategies, which obviously you can collect through media, through websites, through Twitter, through the documents of the various organizations involved that I'll talk about as we go through. And it's trying to use that to unpack what seems to be making them tick, which bits of their arguments they might be winning, and by implication, although that's obviously for more of a discussion, how you might combat those, assuming we want to do so. But there's also, I think, underlying that also an important thing for me as a political scientist to underscore that it is things like these basic political challenges can't just be wished away, right? That actually there is something interesting things going on in net zero, the attacks on net zero, in the backlash, or if we want to call it populist or not, but certainly in the backlash against climate action, that there are some mobilizations over some real fears about the ways in which climate change action is being pursued in the UK that actually also are quite useful to take seriously, rather than just say, oh, they're idiots, right? That's not going to help us win, right? So there's been a relatively recent, you can date it to mid-2021, as we will in a minute, sharp increase in the number of political attacks on net zero and on climate action more broadly in the UK. And it's centered, we think, on this group, or this is how we organize the research anyway, it's to center it on this group of called the Net Zero Scrutiny Group of Conservative MPs. And you will have come across some of these names and so on. So that's sort of context in the immediate sense. And it speaks, there's a literature in the more sort of climate policy literature about the idea of climate policy dismantling, right? What happened, how does it work when you have an established set of policy arrangements and people seek to dismantle that? Sometimes it happens sort of just by the wayside, what they call passive dismantling, right? You just stop funding a particular subsidy program or whatever. It's still on the books, but you just don't give it any money. And sometimes it's more active. The general story in that literature is that actually full-scale dismantling of policy architectures that are well institutionalized, such as the Climate Change Act in Britain, is actually quite difficult, and it needs a full-scale political onslaught, which I'm not sure we could say we're at that yet, but it's certainly something that I think the people involved in this would like to see. And what we do then is we are calling it populism, and I'll unpack why we use that term to talk about it as we go along. Okay, yes, and the final note at the bottom is the data collection for this was all done through till about mid-July. So anything that's happened here is, in terms of the empirical data, is conjecture. But clearly, when Truss became MP, some of the people that I'm going to talk about became cabinet members, became members of her senior advisory group, and so there was more of a danger then. They're not there now under Rishi Sunak. At least I don't think any of them are there still under Sunak. So it's a different dynamic already. But that's just speaking to the chaos of British politics at the moment in general. Does this want to move? Now this is when the battery goes and all the devices. There we go. Thank you. So we collected the media articles focused on the idea of a backlash against net zero, and we used that to identify the key actors as a sort of preliminary ground clearing. Who are these people? What are they doing? How are they organising? Establish some sort of timeline, and also we focused on when they attack net zero, what are the specifics that they attack? And one of the things that's become interesting is that you've got a sort of overarching argument about net zero is going to be a disaster, it's going to destroy Britain, blah, blah, blah. Come to some of those details in a minute. But you've also got these very specific things about heat pumps or about targets. And there's a relationship between these specific objects of the attack and the sort of more general overarching set of arguments. Ooh, now it's going all over the place. Sorry. Was that me or was that you? Okay. Which is actually going to be something I think that we'll explore more. It was like maybe it's possible for actors to sort of find a target that they really like they think that it's going to be popular. Heat pumps is a good hypothesis from my point of view, and use that to sort of attack the heat pump policy, but also leverage that up to sort of undermining policy and the goals in general. So then once we'd identified those key actors and so on, we then went to look at media, collected all the media articles. This is from about mid-2021 to about June 2022, about those people and by those people and organizations, and to look at their rhetoric and arguments in a bit more detail. And then we looked at the websites of their organizations or their own personal websites, and we looked at their Twitter accounts. Anybody who's done work on it used to be dead easy to automate Twitter cheat, and it's much more complicated now. It's still quite possible. It's better than lots of other sources, but we didn't get as far as doing that. We did essentially a manual trawl back of either hashtags or personal accounts to find the material, which is very laborious. Okay, so this is a rough timeline, and you'll see some of these names coming in there. So in mid-May, Steve Baker publishes a first article criticizing net zero as a goal in general. And I don't think anybody had really, they would probably be murmuring within themselves, but this is when they go public. And Craig McKinley a bit later on. And then what you see is a series of letters over the course of that year and into early 2022 with an expanding range of numbers of Conservative MPs going public of saying we think net zero is going to be a disaster for the UK economy and society and so on. And then there's some other things that are in there that I won't necessarily say too much about. One is that outside it starts to spread beyond the group of Tory MPs. It becomes, there's other organisations start organising outside Parliament. Key of those is the one that was on the first slide, which is Power Not Poverty. Sorry, yes, Power Not Poverty, which is Nigel Farage's organisation. He tries to organise a rally in March 2022, and it completely flops. But you know, that's still an organisation with I think somewhere in the realm of 100,000 Twitter followers. So it's got a presence of some sort. And you also then can see, I mean, it does be one thing we haven't yet done, but I think we think is important is the invasion of Ukraine and the natural gas, the inflation crisis, cost of living, all of that stuff. We're actually going to go and try before we get this published is to disentangle the storylines before and after that event. We think there's going to be some shifts, but we don't know that yet because we haven't sort of disentangle the data that way. But you do then start to see some things that can be interpreted as effects, of which the fracking review in April, and then obviously once Liz Truss comes in, a much more full-on announcements about revisiting fracking and new licenses for North Sea oil and gas. So actually, that's still under Johnson, isn't it? So that's a rough timeline. The key organisations we're talking about at the heart of this is the Net Zero Scrutiny Group, which is about 20 to 25 Conservative MPs. The best known people are Steve Baker and Craig McKinley, who came up there. They work quite well. I wouldn't say they work necessarily that closely with the Global Warming Policy Foundation, explicitly so. They did notice yesterday that Lord Frost, who is not actually a member of these MPs, but has just become a trustee of the GWPF. The Global Warming Policy Foundation, for those who don't know, is the longest standing climate denial organisation in the UK. It was founded by Nigel Lawson, Margaret Thatcher's finance minister, and Nigella Lawson's dad, if you care about such things. But so that's explicitly a climate denial organisation. I'm going to come back to the point about climate denial in a bit, though. But they formed a project, an initiative within the GWPF called Net Zero Watch, which is still going, to try and track along the lines of a lot of those sort of watch type organisation projects that actually start on the left. Those are historically, it's Corporate Watch, which is against transnational corporations for all of their abuses, and then people, actors on the right, have appropriated that way of organising. Then there's Power Not Poverty, which is Nigel Farage's operation. There's another group within Parliament, which is called the All Parliamentary Group for Fair Fuel for UK motorists and UK hauliers. We'll call it APPG, because that's the acronym that gets used for a minute when we come back to it. That's cross-party. It's still majority Conservative. It's probably 2/3 Conservative MPs. Graham Stringer is a member of it, former leader of Manchester City Council, if memory serves right, and a sort of oddball Labour MP, and there are one or two others. I think he's the only Labour MP, but and then in the media itself, you can also you can think of places like the Telegraph as the Mail and the Express as, if you like, places where these stories are being pushed, but you can also think of them as actors in their own right, trying to push that agenda. And the talk radio and GB News is also clearly there, but we haven't been able to capture that. It's a very different type of data collection to capture that sort of material. These, I'd say, would be the four most important figures that come up most regularly. Craig McKinley and Steve Baker are both Conservative MPs. Steve Baker was the Northern Ireland minister in Truss's government, so he was one of the ones who ended up in cabinet. Nigel Farage. Richard Tice is the current head of whatever it's called, Reform UK, which was UKIP back in the day. And so there's a whole set of questions, which I think why the word populism works is that you're seeing a particular sort of political project transferring its objects from Europe to immigrants to etc. to now climate. So if we turn now to the sort of more general level, what do they say about why do they dislike net zero and how do they attack it? One sort of storyline that comes through regularly is that it's technologically infeasible, it's poorly thought through, it's disastrous for the way of life, and usually with an argument, which is again a standard populist argument, although it can of course be another sort of argument, proper social justice argument, but usually putting an emphasis on is disastrous, particularly for the poor. And it's usually also articulated, because it's Conservative MPs, with some sense that it's politically damaging, therefore, to the Conservative Party and its prospects. I'm not going to read through all the examples, but these are just essentially illustrative examples for the types of arguments I'll sketch. The second sort of argument is that it's fiscally irresponsible policy by incompetent technocrats. And again, the populist element here is unelected elites destroying people's lives, over-governing, trying to do too much, and elites versus the people sort of a narrative. But there's a whole series of these saying it's going to cost billions and they haven't costed it and they've no idea what's going on. and so on. We can deal with all the technicalities of these arguments. The point of our project is it's not always only about those technicalities. You're not necessarily going to win the argument just by demonstrating that they're bullshitting. And the third one is that that net zero policy exacerbates the cost of living crisis, right? And our hunch is that that argument becomes stronger after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, obviously. When we get to breaking it down over time, it's clearly something that only makes sense in the context of the natural gas price rise, but that actually precedes the invasion of Ukraine by about 6 months. And natural gas prices are already going up considerably before then. And so that's, again, articulating with a sort of social justice agenda to try and gain support for the overall argument. The one point I would make is that of all of the material we collected over about a year's worth of media statements by and about these people, climate denial is you can only find it in one document out of, I don't know the total number of documents, but it's probably in the realm of 300 or 400. And that's in a piece by Nigel Lawson, who's already well known as a climate denier. So none of the people, whatever we think Steve Baker has in his head, whether he thinks climate change is a hoax or not, they are not saying it publicly, right? They know that doesn't work as an argument. Either they don't believe, they're not climate deniers, or they're not that type of climate denier anyway, or they are just rhetorically say this is a stupid argument, we're not going there, we don't need it. But I think that's there is something interesting in that, and because I think partly when people get fixated on opposition to climate policy, we go too quickly to the climate denial argument. I actually don't think it's necessary. It's certainly not in the UK context that important. Now this is sorry. Yeah, there we go. So then what we looked at as we unpacked was, okay, there's a general attack, but there's also a number of things, specific things that they focus on to try to undermine climate policy. This is a rough table of the numbers that mention specific targets, and the rows rather are the articles by core backlash actors, so people like Craig McKinley and Steve Baker, number of media articles with a critique of climate policy in which those people and organizations are mentioned, and then specific mentions in their Twitter accounts of any of these targets. Obviously, there's a number of articles also that don't mention any of them, but this is the ones that do have targets. Right, for us, I think there were two surprises when we just sort of looked through this and counted it up. One is how prominent fracking is. Maybe there's people in the room who weren't surprised with that, but we didn't actually think specifically of fracking when we went in and thinking what would the targets be. We weren't, I was sure it would have been mentioned, but how dominant it is, we weren't sure. The second is that partly because we read about these sorts of things from climate justice activists, is there was absolutely no mention of land grabs for carbon offsets. So people in the climate justice movement are making quite a lot of how, estates in Scotland and sheep farms in Wales are already being bought up by corporations to fulfill their net zero targets, and there's social justice and sustainability aspects of that being highlighted, but they don't make any use of that, despite the fact that they do make tactical use of environmental justice arguments in other contexts. So there are a few articles, for example, where they attack electric vehicles by going on about the poor working conditions of people mining the lithium in Chile, right, which is a standard environmental justice sort of argument that they're then sort of appropriating. So the dominant ones are these: fracking, heat pumps, renewable energy generally, electric vehicles, the petrol and diesel ban specifically, and low traffic neighborhoods. And I'll talk a bit about how they talk about those now. Sorry, yeah. Oh, sorry. Now then it worked on me, so we went across. So is that? Hang on. Is that? Yes. No, that is next. Sorry. So the key differences here is that on the. Hang on a sec. Have I? Oh no. Okay. Yeah. So this is a sort of synthesis of how those arguments get talked about. On heat pumps, electric vehicles, and the petrol diesel ban. Here, it seems to us that actors are working with quite credible claims about social justice and the rapidity of the transformation in order to mobilize some sorts of backlash. So they're working against a technocratic policy. It is the case that the heat pump, the transformation of British heating systems from gas to electric was announced essentially in the Green Industrial Revolution policy from late 2019 or early 2020, on an incredibly short timescale, a sort of timescale that's necessary from a point of view of getting to zero or net zero carbon, whichever version of that, but nevertheless seemed to come from nowhere. Announced with flashily by Boris Johnson, as everything by him is announced flashily. So in a sense, what they're doing is actually very relatively effectively mobilizing against things where people do feel that their lives are being radically disrupted, or they're going to have things imposed on them that are extremely expensive and they haven't got the money to do that. And so it works with the grain of some popular concern about the legitimacy of that policy. And there's a stronger emphasis in those arguments about politicizing the technocratic arguments, right? Saying this is incompetent bureaucrats who've not thought this through. They've said we're going to change 22 million houses from gas to electric in 10 years. That can't be done, all of that sort of stuff. Those arguments are really strong. In the fracking ban, which sort of stands on its own amongst these, actors are working against policymakers because the policy environment is now reasonably established as a fracking moratorium for quite a long time. But they're also working against local opposition to fracking. You can look around and find reasonable, opposition in lots of places to heat pumps and so on, and find that support, right? There's varying sorts, right? You can go to the GMB union and they're really vehemently opposed to the heat pump transformation because they're members of gas fitters. So you've got other sorts of support for that. Here, however, fracking is exceptionally unpopular. Right? The public opinion polls are very, very consistently against fracking in general. And in the places where the fracking sites might be, or have been in the past, was it Balcombe down in Sussex or Preston Road up in Lancashire? Very, very strong local opposition to those, to fracking. And so what they then do is they actually sort of politicize the policy, saying by saying that the people in favour of the fracking ban are all in the pay of the Russians. That's in a couple of the articles, accusing sort of anti-fracking activists of being in the pay of the Russians, which is sort of funny. But also they sort of depoliticize it. They actually then go to a sort of sciencey argument and say, well, the science says fracking is fine. It's all going to be safe, blah, blah, blah. The earthquakes thing is a bit overplayed. There's not going to be any contamination of water. And so the fracking is sort of founded on some claim to scientific credibility, which is rather opposite to the general version of their arguments. And it's here also that it's clearest that they have the strongest support from the vested interests in the fracking industry, right? So Quadrilla come up in the articles at the same time as Steve Baker and Craig McKinley, or they are saying, as Quadrilla says, fracking is going to be safe. The final one, though, which is back in here, is this low traffic neighborhoods one. And we were interested in this because this is sort of where you do actually have quite a lot of, quotes, generally grassroots opposition to low traffic neighborhoods, including direct action, people driving cars through the barrages and stuff like that. And there's loads in the mainstream media about low traffic neighborhoods, but the net zero populists never talk about it at all. And so it's almost like there's a massive missed opportunity for them, which raises a question for us about what's actually making them tick. And so what we would say about this is that well, I'll come back to this. So I think it's worth thinking about it as a populist one. And for those, outside social sciences or study of politics, classically populism is a sort of really, really simplified account of politics where it's the elites versus the people. The people is always thought of as a homogenous thing. So it's not necessarily a democratic politics, even though democratic by definition means rule of the people. In democratic accounts, there would be some sense that the people is not necessarily a single thing, and therefore there's a process by which the will of the people is established. The populists will usually then have a rhetoric which says, we know the will of the people against these elites, right? So So it's got a classic sense of a lot of that rhetoric. It's not that about say the fact that they're not very popular doesn't mean they're not being populist. Those are not the same thing, right? And so I think you've got combinations of establishment actors defending the status quo while pretending to be outsiders. You even get to a point where Boris Johnson is pretending to be an outsider from the attacking the establishment. And we do think that we can say that these are reasonably closely allied to incumbent fossil fuel interests, right? They are doing some of what the work they're doing is about defending those interests. That's why fracking is so important to them. That's why they're probably not being able to deal with the low traffic neighborhoods thing so effectively, because it's not central to their concerns, and why they don't care about land grabs for carbon offsets, because the same sets of vested interests will be the big landowners. So that's a hunch. We don't know that, but that's a hunch, a plausible hunch. There is a lot of mobilization of concerns about economic inequality, and I think from the point of view of the design of climate policy, that is a really useful take home, to say that some of this is arising because the policies have been designed over long periods of time, not just the rapid heat pump thing. But if you think about large swathes of policies that get people to do things differently in their homes or with their cars or whatever, have been based on sorts of fiscal subsidy incentives, the feed-in tariff program to make it so you get some income out of putting solar on your roof, the heat pump subsidy, which is still in place, although it's not as generous as it was, older energy efficiency things have all been subsidies. There was a subsidy in place for a while for the purchase of electric vehicles, I think. There definitely has been elsewhere. I think there was in the UK as well. In other words, these always function as subsidies that make it relatively easy for university professors to do all of that stuff. But if you're even in the bottom 50% of the income scale, there's no way those ever touch you, right? So they are policies that increase inequality almost systematically, right? And British society's got more unequal in general for lots of other reasons, more important than that's those specific subsidies. But nevertheless, in the context where society is very unequal, then you get other things, other policies that come in that have very, very regressive effects. It becomes relatively straightforward to mobilize those around those. And the other aspect of it is that it's not only about economic equality, and that's the standard argument about Brexit, for example, as well, that it was mobilization of that sort of economic resentment generated by inequality. And then it's also a defense of established cultural practices. So one strand throughout is a generalized libertarianism, states telling us what to do. He can't tell me what I should be driving or how I should heat my home. The other, though, is particular attachments to particular things, right? Petrol cars, probably the most important of those, not just cars, but petrol cars. Gas boilers as well. There's quite a lot of people, but I really like my boiler, which is a slightly odd thing to get really excited about, but each to their own. The second point, I think, is that I think it is important to see this backlash as an integral part of how policy is designed in pretty much all countries. The UK is not alone in this, as trying to do it as a depoliticized, taking it out of the realm of political competition, treating it as a technical problem. We're just going to have we're just going to have 5-year carbon budgets, and we're going to manage things and blah blah blah. Not think very much about the patterns of inequality or about how those sorts of oppositions may be incorporated. Assume that climate change is in everybody's interests to address, and just sort of wish away those sorts of conflicts. So anybody, it's a really common argument that anybody objects to a specific bit of climate policy must be a denier. When I worked on carbon markets, I got accused of being a climate denier because I thought I was saying that carbon markets generated all these, especially carbon offsets generated all these, unintended effects, and they didn't work and blah blah blah. Oh, you must be opposed to you must not believe climate change exists. Right? That simplistic conflation is, I think, part of the root of these sorts of phenomena. And a very specific lack of attention to questions of inequality and poverty and how policy is designed. Fuel duty, yes. But allied to this, which is connected to that point, the fuel duty escalator history, which is that there is a longer history of populist anti-environmentalism in the UK. Right? There's the best known examples are the fuel protests of 2000, which shut down a lot of oil refineries. Those of us who are old enough to remember, and were in the UK at the time. And groups like the Alliance of British Drivers, they never came up in our things, but I had a look on their website in general. They never came up in the media searches because the media don't cite them. But you would find their site on that net zero quite illuminating. Shall we just leave it there? Thank you. And there's also then a notable continuity in the organizations over time, right? So they are not just populist anti-environmental or anti-climate organizations. They're also the same people who are involved in anti-Europe, anti-immigration, other sites of populist action. During the Brexit campaign, it became reasonably well known that the Global Warming Policy Foundation and Leave UK shared a building. They were in the same building and sharing resources, funded by similar sets of interests. And so that also then makes this sort of third point then, is that the attack on climate policy is also embedded in a broader attack on liberal democratic ways of governing and so on. So you've got the close links of the Brexit groups to climate backlash, and you've got broadly similar sets of rhetorical arguments, and this combination of a sort of focus on attacking elites, mobilizing about inequality and justice, and a sort of culture wars, for want of a better word, dynamic. And I think I'm nearly there. Yeah, that's the last one. So 5 minutes is perfect. So I think the implications then, as I think, I would say probably that the threat in the short term, the threat to actual overall destabilization of net zero as a goal, or climate action as a goal, is probably quite low. There's about 20 to 25 of these MPs in the Conservative Party. The Conservative Party is in complete chaos and crisis anyway, which creates opportunities for them in some ways, because the pure numbers may not actually, the relatively low numbers may not matter. But the Conservative Environment Network, for example, of MPs has something like 120, 130 members, some of whom are very vocally in favour of net zero. One of Liz Truss's strategies seemed to me to be get the leader of that group, Chris Skidmore, who'd actually founded himself quite quickly a net zero support group, deliberately using the same acronym to confuse people, apparently. I don't know why that would be a good idea. But and she got him to be the person to come in and run this review of net zero that she instituted, which is, I'm assuming now, not got the same value. It's a bit hard to know what's going on. He then got into trouble for not voting for the fracking ban, but not voting to lift the fracking ban. But I think the threat to some of these specific initiatives could be higher, right? I think it could derail, you know, if they were better at arguing and messaging and they organised effectively, it could derail, for example, over heat pumps, the dates for a petrol or diesel phase out. And if they articulated with it the low traffic neighbourhoods, they could start to undermine, because those are where they've actually got the strongest sense that they can find popular support for their positions. And fracking, it looks like they've already lost that, but that's not necessarily because they tried and failed. That there's so much chaos going on, but we'll see. But I think they also still pose a very significant constraint on Conservative governments getting any more ambitious on climate policy, because basically any Conservative Prime Minister at the moment is basically just doing crisis management of the 7 or 8 or 10 or however many you think there are factions within the Parliamentary Conservative Party, where actually the number 25 starts to look quite important, right? So they may become important to assuage in order to keep them on board in some way. I think the other thing then is also most of it, I mean, I worked in Canada for a long time where the political and the funding environment and so on was very different. But in the UK, we've got, I think most of us have got used to this idea that A, there's shed loads of money in climate research. B, you have to do impact work as part of it. And C, there's an implied assumption that if you come up with really good stuff, government might listen. The impact might be possible. And I think that last point is the weakest now, right? So it may be that you know, what happens, for example, if the current government issues a new UKRI funding call that says We want to fund projects that will demonstrate how we can expand North Sea oil and gas and meet our net zero targets. And that creates a new sort of dilemma, I think. There's always dilemmas for researchers when you engage with policy, but that's a new sort of one, right? Because we chase the money to chase the impact on the presumption that we're not doing anything horrible. But I'm not sure that could be a dimension which makes different things for us as researchers. I will stop there. Those time, hopefully enough there, and happy to respond to whatever questions you have.
Thank you very much.